Mud splattered Margaret's boots as the rancher's gaze, cold as prairie wind, swept over her. "You the cook?" he clipped. "Kitchen's that way." She knew then this wasn't just a job, it was a test. Little did he know, she was the one choosing. Dust swirled low along the dry street of the western town of Creswell, where whispers traveled faster than wagons. Folks leaned against storefronts, eyes narrowing as a young woman walked past with a single satchel and dust on her boots. The saloon doors creaked, but no one stepped out. Just murmurs. "She's headed to the Winters place," someone muttered. "Fool girl won't last a week. No one ever does." The Winters ranch stood on the far edge of town, vast, wind-beaten, and quiet as a graveyard. It had no charm, no porch flowers, only the silhouette of a man people called the coldest in Creswell. Margaret stopped at the gate, heart-thrumming, 24 years old, with the calloused hands of a kitchen girl and the eyes of someone who had learned too young what betrayal tasted like. She had left her last job at a boarding house 2 towns over, not because she wanted to, but because she had been accused of stealing the owner's watch. No trial, no chance to explain, just judgment and whispers. She was not here to beg. She was here to cook. Her knock echoed once, then twice before the door creaked open. The man standing there was broad-shouldered, dressed in worn denim and a clean white shirt. His eyes were slate gray, unblinking. "You the cook?" he asked. She nodded. "I am Margaret Walker?" He hesitated. "Kitchen's that way. No welcome, no handshake, only instruction." But Margaret didn't flinch. She stepped inside. The house was cold despite the late afternoon sun. Silent. The kind of silence that made you feel like laughter would break something sacred. She found the kitchen, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. Her hands knew what to do. Beef stew simmering over flame, fresh dough baked to golden. She stirred with intention, not just to fill a belly, but to say, "I am not what they say." Upper was laid out in 30 minutes. The long table looked too large for just one man, but only Samuel came. He sat, glanced at the spread, and picked up his fork. Not a word. Margaret stood to the side, waiting. He chewed slowly, then swallowed. He looked up at her, expression unreadable. "You done?" he asked, setting his fork down. She stiffened. "Yes, I was told this was a trial day." He leaned back. "No one lasts more than one." He opened his mouth, likely to say the same dismissal he had said to countless others, until a small voice called from behind the doorway. "Papa, wait." A little girl in a yellow dress, no older than 6, darted into the room. Curly hair tied in 2 ribbons, cheeks flushed. She ran to Margaret, wrapped her arms around the woman's waist, and stood on tiptoe. Then she whispered loud enough only for Margaret to hear, "Don't worry, I picked you to be my mommy." Margaret froze. Samuel blinked. "Abigail, I sold my stories to Mr. Howley," the girl said brightly. "He said I was a real good writer. Gave me coins. I paid Miss June to write the letter." Samuel's brows furrowed. "You did what?" Abigail's grip tightened around Margaret. "I told you I wanted a mama. You never listened, so I found one myself." Margaret looked down, her chest tightening. The child's arms around her waist felt warmer than any hearth. She was not just here to cook. She was an answer to a prayer written in a child's hand. And somewhere deep in that cold house, something began to thaw. If that moment stirred something in you, if you believe some meals feed more than hunger, tap the hype button and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. We're just getting started. The morning sun barely warmed the wooden walls of the Winters Ranch house. Its weak light spilled across the parlor floor like a whisper, present, but not enough to ease the chill that clung to the silence. Samuel stood rigid in the center of the room, arms crossed over his chest, jaw clenched tight as a locked gate. The tension in him was nearly visible, coiled and sharp. Abigail sat on the stairs, her small boots thudding softly against the wood. Legs swinging, eyes trained on her father, with a mixture of worry and quiet defiance. "You cannot just hire people behind my back," Samuel said. His voice was low but carried the kind of edge that cut without raising volume. "I did not hire her," Abigail replied simply. "I invited her." Margaret stood near the doorway, her posture careful but proud. She had never felt more aware of herself. Her hands slightly red from scrubbing, her faded skirt, her presence in this home that wasn't hers. She could feel every breath, every heartbeat. Her cheeks burned, not from shame, but from the knowledge that she had become the center of a storm she did not start. Samuel turned his gaze to her, his expression unreadable. "I do not run a charity." Margaret's back straightened. "I did not ask for charity," she said calmly. "I came to cook. If that offer no longer stands, I will gather my things." Before Samuel could reply, Abigail jumped from the stairs and darted across the floor. She wrapped her arms around Margaret's waist, holding on tightly. "Please, Papa," she pleaded. "Just for a little while, just try." Samuel looked at his daughter, his jaw still locked, then glanced at Margaret. Whatever emotion passed through his eyes was gone before it could settle. He turned and walked away without a word. The door closed behind him with a sharp click, final and cold. Margaret let out a slow breath. Her pride felt rubbed raw. She hadn't been accepted by the man in the house, but chosen instead by a child, like a piece of fabric plucked from a shelf, something pretty to fill a hole. He should have walked out, but Abigail looked up at her with eyes so wide and aching when the girl slipped her hand into hers and whispered, "Please don't leave me." Something inside Margaret cracked, not a break, but a soft unraveling. "I'll stay," Margaret said gently, "for now." The days that followed settled into a pattern, unspoken, uneasy, but real. Samuel barely offered more than a few clipped words. He walked with purpose, spoke only when necessary, and kept his distance. He rose before the sun and returned when it had long since gone down. Margaret did her work in silence. She cooked each meal with care, scrubbed until her hands ached, and kept to herself. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry, but every movement she made said, "I am not here to beg, I am here to earn." Abigail was the light in the space between them. She talked, she laughed, she drew pictures of a family that did not quite exist. She taped them to the walls like decorations for a holiday only she believed in. She left a chair for Mama at every meal. Margaret hesitated the first time Abigail pulled it out. Samuel said nothing. She sat. Then one night, after hours of kneading dough and chopping firewood, Margaret opened her bedroom door to find a warm stone bottle sitting just outside. No note, no name. But she knew Samuel had noticed, and sometimes a gesture without words spoke louder than any welcome ever could. The wind howled louder than usual that night, slipping through the cracks of the wooden walls like a warning. Snow danced in the moonlight outside, and the fire in the hearth popped and hissed as if uneasy itself. Margaret had just finished cleaning up from supper. She wiped her hands on her apron, the edges threadbare, and reached to blow out the last lamp when a cough cut through the silence. Then another, sharper, deeper, followed by a soft whimper. She turned toward the hallway. "Abigail?" The child's bedroom door creaked open. Margaret stepped inside and found Abigail curled in her blankets, cheeks flushed in alarming red, her tiny chest rising and falling too fast. "Abigail, sweet girl." Margaret rushed to the bed, placed a hand to the girl's forehead. Hot, burning. Another cough, harsher this time, rocked the small body. Abigail's breath hitched. Seconds later, footsteps pounded down the hall. Samu appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, shirt half-buttoned. His eyes, usually so guarded, were wide with fear. "What's wrong with her?" he asked, voice rough, almost cracking. "She's burning up," Margaret replied, voice steady. "We need to cool her down. Bring me a basin, water, and some cloths now." Samuel hesitated for a breath too long. "Go!" Margaret snapped. He vanished and within moments returned with what she asked. Margaret rolled up her sleeves. She moved like someone who had done this before. Not panicked, but precise. She rummaged through the kitchen in haste, found jars of dried herbs, fever frubue, elderflower, peppermint tucked in the back of a dusty cabinet. She crushed them quickly, her fingers moving by memory, the way the old cook at the boarding house had taught her. Back in the room, the kettle hissed. She steeped the herbs, strained them into a cup, and returned to Abigail. The little girl whimpered again, barely able to open her eyes. Margaret dipped a cloth in cool water and placed it on the girl's forehead. She lifted Abigail gently into her lap, coaxing the child to take slow sips of the bitter brew. "I'm here," she whispered, rocking her slightly. "I've got you, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere. She began to hum low, gentle, a lullaby she barely remembered from childhood. Something her mother used to sing when fevers came and wood stoves roared. Outside, the wind moaned. Inside, the only sounds were the pop of the fire and the soft notes of Margaret's voice. The hours dragged. Abigail's fever rose and fell in waves. Margaret stayed with her through it all, wiping sweat, changing cloths, whispering soothing words. She didn't move from her spot, her body aching, but her grip never loosened. At some point, exhaustion overcame her. Head leaning against the bed frame, arms wrapped around Abigail, Margaret drifted into a shallow sleep. That was how Samuel found them. He had been pacing, listening, helpless. Now he stood in the doorway, barefoot, holding a heavy wool blanket. The light from the hallway caught the curve of his jaw, the crease in his brow. He said nothing. There in front of him was his daughter, safe, sleeping, wrapped in the arms of a woman who was not kin, not paid to stay, yet had not left. The blanket in his arms suddenly felt heavier. He walked forward slowly and draped it over both of them. His hand lingered a second longer on Abigail's back, then on Margaret's shoulder. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. So instead he stepped back quietly. Without a sound, he disappeared down the hall, and he did not sleep that night. Not because of fear, but because something inside him had shifted. And for the first time in years, Samuel Winters found himself wondering what it might mean to let someone stay. The sun filtered weakly through the kitchen window the next morning. Pale light settled across the wooden counters and the well-worn floor, revealing the quiet stillness of a home that had seen more silence than laughter. The scent of rosemary bread floated in the air, warm and comforting, but it couldn't soften the tension lingering just beneath the surface. Margaret poured tea into 2 mugs. Her back was straight, chin lifted with the quiet pride. She refused to sit down, even when everything inside her felt scraped raw. Her arms ached from the night before, from carrying, stirring, wiping, rocking. Her heart ached more, bruised in a way muscle could never be. Samuel stood near the doorframe, hat in hand, gaze fixed to a knot in the floorboards. The lines around his mouth were drawn tighter than usual. "She's better," he said at last, voice rough. Margaret nodded, her tone measured. Fever broke just before dawn. He shifted, the floor creaking faintly beneath his boots. "I thank you for what you did." She waited just a breath longer. Maybe just this once, there would be something more, something kind. But then he added, "Don't mistake this. I didn't ask for you." The words struck like a slap, clean and quiet. Margaret blinked once, keeping her voice from trembling. "Of course." He turned and walked away, leaving the kitchen colder than it had been moments before. Margaret stood still. She watched the steam rise from the mugs, curl and vanish. Then she exhaled slowly and turned to the day ahead. She swept the floors, folded Abigail's clean dress, skimmed the broth from the morning stew. Her hands moved from habit, but everything felt heavier, not from labor, but from being needed, yet unwanted, trusted with life, but not welcomed with heart. Still she stayed, not for him, for Abigail. Rain came that week, steady and unrelenting. The fields turned to mud, the air stayed damp, and the house creaked with old aches. One morning, Margaret stepped out early to tend to the chickens. By the time she came back, her shawl was soaked through and her hair stuck to her neck. But outside the coop laid neatly beside the fence was a patch of clean, dry straw, just enough to keep her boots from sinking. She said nothing, but the next evening she found a new chair beside the hearth, sturdy, carved, smoother than the splintery stool she usually used to mend clothes. It was placed exactly where she often sat to sew, a blanket folded over the backrest. No one mentioned it. Either of them were good with words, but sometimes silence spoke louder than speech. One afternoon she was in the herb garden when Samuel came up from the barn, sleeves rolled and dirt caked under his nails. "Those herbs any good for bruises?" he asked. She looked up. "Comrie helps. Maybe arnica." He nodded. After a pause, she added, "My mother used to make balm from dandelion roots. Said even the weeds could be turned to kindness." He glanced at her. "She passed when I was 16. I'm sorry," he said softer this time. She studied his face. Creased, tired, trying. You don't trust easily. He didn't deny it. Too many reasons not to. Another beat. No woman ever stays, he muttered. They all leave or take. Her chest tightened. She swallowed hard. Is that what you think of me? He looked away. She stepped back. Say it. Say you want me gone? He opened his mouth but said nothing. That's what I thought, and she walked away. The rain came heavy that night, sheets of silver lashing against the wooden walls, thunder rolling in slow, distant groans. The fire in the hearth crackled low, shadows dancing along the walls of Margaret's small room. She stood by the window, one hand resting on the wooden frame, the other clutching the satchel she had arrived with. It was not heavy. She never had much. Just a change of clothes, a book of recipes, a stitched towel her mother had once embroidered with roses, now faded to near invisibility, and now a heart heavier than all those things combined. Her room was quiet, the rest of the house even more so. She could hear no footsteps, no child's giggle, no creak of boots. She knelt beside the small desk, opened the book of recipes, and flipped to a doggered page. Apple dumplings. It read, Abigail's favorite, scribbled in with messy child handwriting next to the printed title. Margaret smiled through a bitter exhale. She picked up a pencil and wrote beneath it, So you'll always have me in the kitchen, even if I'm gone. She closed the book gently, then placed it on the girl's bed. Her footsteps were silent on the wooden floors. No one stirred as she slipped through the hallway, past the empty parlor, and toward the front door. She did not expect anyone to stop her. By now she understood her place. The sky outside was a quilt of thunderclouds. Rain poured without mercy, turning dirt paths to mud and soaking her dress within seconds. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, bowed her head, and walked. She didn't know where she would go. Somewhere, anywhere but here, where warmth was borrowed and words of kindness always came with terms. She passed the stable, its lantern dim behind foggy glass. That was when she heard it, a scream. Hi, piercing. Margaret. She turned sharply. Abigail's small form darted across the yard, barefoot in the rain, nightgown clinging to her like a second skin. She was crying, sobbing, slipping through mud. Abigail, no! Margaret ran, dropping her satchel. The little girl had gone through the stable doors, which now swung open in the storm wind. Inside, the horses whinnied in panic, hooves clattering against wood. One stall had been left unlatched. A young Mustang bucked wildly, spooked by thunder and movement. Dang, Abigail, stop! But it was too late. The child slipped, fell hard onto the slick straw, too close to the rearing horse. The animal shrieked and lifted its hooves. Margaret didn't think. She lunged forward, sliding through mud and straw, scooping Abigail into her arms and shielding her with her body, just as the hooves came crashing down, missing them by inches. She curled around the child, breathless, heart hammering like a war drum. The storm outside raged on. And then, footsteps. Samuel burst into the stable, eyes wild, pistol in hand. The moment he saw them, Margaret drenched and trembling, arms wrapped around his daughter. His whole body seemed to freeze. The horse had backed into its stall. The danger had passed, but the scene remained. Margaret didn't see him. She was too focused on the girl in her arms. You're safe now, she whispered. You're safe. Abigail cried into her shoulder. Don't leave me. I won't, Margaret breathed, though she no longer knew if it was truth or a wish. Samuel stepped forward finally. His voice was low, shaken. Why? Why would you risk yourself like that? Margaret looked up slowly, hair plastered to her face, mud on her dress, eyes burning with something deeper than anger. Because she's worth it, he stared at her. Something inside him gave way, something old, armored, and held too tight for too long. He knelt beside them, reached out, then hesitated. Margaret, he said softly, you were leaving? She nodded. I thought it was better that way. I never asked you to go. You never asked me to stay. Their eyes met finally without pride, without blame, only truth. And in that dim stable, with rain dripping from the rafters, and a frightened child held between them. A different kind of silence bloomed. Not the cold kind, the waiting kind. The kind that comes before something is said or something begins. The storm passed slowly, leaving behind a sky still bruised with clouds and a world soaked in silence. The air inside the house was warmer than outside, but only just. The fire in the hearth cast a soft orange glow across the floorboards. Samuel sat on the rug in front of the fire, boots off, sleeves rolled, holding a wool blanket close around Abigail. She lay half asleep in his arms, flushed but safe. Margaret sat nearby, drying her wet hair with a towel, her clothes exchanged for a borrowed flannel shirt that hung slightly loose on her frame. Her eyes were red, not from rain, but from something else she wouldn't admit. They had not spoken since returning from the stables. The only sound in the room was the quiet crackle of firewood. At last, Samuel broke the silence. "She was strong," he said. "My wife." Margaret looked up slowly. "Ruth, that was her name." He didn't look at Margaret as he spoke. His eyes were fixed on the flames. He could outride most of the men on this land. Laughed louder than thunder. "Everyone said, I married above my luck." He let out a dry breath. When the sickness came, it took 6 in the town. She was the 7th. I watched it happen, couldn't stop it, couldn't help. Margaret's hands stilled in her lap. After that, I stopped talking much. Folks figured I was bitter. Maybe I was, but mostly I was just afraid. His voice dropped. I didn't care if they thought I was cold. Let them think what they want. As long as Abigail was safe, that's all I could control. Margaret's throat tightened. "I don't hate women, Margaret," he added after a pause. "I just didn't know how to open that door again. Not after watching it close so hard once." Margaret swallowed. "And yet you let me in," she said softly. "I didn't." He finally turned to look at her. "You did that on your own." She held his gaze. No anger, no challenge, just quiet recognition. "You don't have to be alone," she said barely above a whisper. "No one should have to carry grief alone." Samuel looked down at his daughter, sleeping peacefully in the crook of his arm. "She talked about you before you even arrived," he murmured. "Said you'd come with fire in your hands and soup that smelled like home." Margaret smiled faintly. She was right. Samuel's voice was barely audible now. This house was hollow, empty in a way no hammer or nail could fix. He shifted slightly, laying Abigail gently onto a pillow beside the fire. Then he turned to Margaret. Not close, not reaching, just open. And then he said it. "Stay. Not because my daughter asked. Stay because this house is warmer with you in it." The words hung in the air, unpolished, unplanned, and yet as steady as any vow ever spoken. Margaret blinked once. She did not answer with a yes. She did not leap into his arms. She only nodded slowly, eyes glistening with tears she did not wipe away. Sometimes love wasn't loud. Sometimes it came in the quiet, and sometimes it simply asked you to stay. The next morning, the world outside still wore traces of the night storm. Puddles in the dirt yard, broken twigs scattered like forgotten thoughts. But inside the house, the air felt different, warmer, softer. Margaret rose early. She didn't leave a note. Didn't pen a reply to Samuel's quiet plea from the night before. Instead, she walked into the kitchen, rolled up her sleeves, and started to cook. Bacon sizzled in the pan. Eggs cracked cleanly into a bowl. Warm biscuits rose golden in the oven, and sweet jam, preserved from a jar she'd found tucked away in the pantry, was spooned gently into a small dish. She even poured fresh milk into 3 glasses and laid the table with a faded checkered cloth. The fire was lit, the window opened just enough to let in the morning breeze. For the first time since she arrived, Margaret filled the table not just with food, but with care. When the last biscuit was buttered, she stepped back and took in the sight. Wasn't grand. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like home. Abigail was the first to emerge, rubbing sleep from her eyes still in her nightgown. Her eyes lit up when she saw the spread. "Miss Margaret," she gasped, Did you make all this?" "I did," Margaret said, smiling softly. "For us? For us?" Abigail threw herself forward, arms wrapping tight around Margaret's waist. Then she leaned close and whispered into her apron, "Now you really are my mama." The words hit Margaret like sunshine after a long winter. Her arms folded gently around the girl, and for a long moment, she simply held her, burying her face into the top of Abigail's curls. She didn't know Samuel had entered the room, but she felt him before she saw him. The shift in the air, the quiet stillness of someone watching with a heart too full to speak. When she looked up, he was standing at the doorway. No words him. Then his hand reached out and rested gently on her shoulder. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a declaration, but it was enough. His eyes meeting hers were filled with something Margaret hadn't dared to believe she would see in him. Belonging, trust, and maybe slowly love. They all sat down, Abigail in the middle scooping jam onto her biscuit with a focus only children could muster. Samuel reached for coffee, pouring a second cup without asking, and sliding it across the table to Margaret. She smiled, accepted it. For the first time, the table didn't creak under silence. It pulsed with laughter. Light, unsure, but real. They talked about nothing. The weather, the way the storm had knocked over the fence, whether or not there'd be snow this year. They didn't talk about what happened the night before. They didn't have to. Sometimes a family wasn't built with words. Sometimes it was built one quiet morning at a time. The sun was high when the knock came at the front gate. Margaret had just finished folding laundry, the scent of sun-dried linen still clinging to her sleeves. Abigail was chasing a butterfly across the front yard, her laughter mingling with the warm breeze. It was one of those rare afternoons that felt like everything had finally settled. But the knock changed that. Samuel answered it. 3 men stood outside the fence. Dusty boots, town clothes, and one face Margaret recognized instantly. A former customer from the inn where she used to work. The one who had called her a thief. He pointed a finger past Samuel. "She's here, ain't she? The girl from Patterson's Inn." Samuel narrowed his eyes. "You've got no reason to be on my land." "She's trouble, that one," the man said, not backing down. "Ran off after stealing from the till. Ask anyone in town." "I didn't steal anything," Margaret said, stepping out onto the porch, voice steady, though her heart pounded. "She left before she could be questioned." The man sneered. "That's as good as guilt." Abigail had stopped playing. She walked slowly to Margaret's side, clutching her hand. Samuel stepped down from the porch. He stood tall, eyes cold. "You came all the way out here to throw dirt." "Get off my land." "Fine," the man spat. "But don't say we didn't warn you. Women like her don't stay. They take what they want and run." Margaret's breath caught. The old shame, the false accusations, it all came flooding back. The men turned to go, but one last insult was thrown over the shoulder. "Keep your eyes open, Mr. Walker. That cook of yours has sticky fingers." That was when Samuel moved. He stepped forward loud enough for the men in the whole town, if need be, to hear. "She's not my cook," he said, voice steady as stone. "She's family." The words echoed in the air like thunder before a storm. The men stopped walking. They turned, stunned, but Samuel didn't waver. He didn't blink. Behind him, Abigail released Margaret's hand and ran forward. She threw her arms around Margaret's waist and shouted with every ounce of her little lungs. "She's my mama." The words rang out like a church bell, pure and bright. Margaret looked down, tears springing to her eyes. Samuel stepped up behind her and laid his hand gently on her shoulder, just like that first morning. But this time not tentative, not uncertain. This was a claim, a declaration, and the men had nothing more to say. They turned and left in silence, swallowed by the road in the distance. That evening the house felt different. It had before, in small ways, quiet changes, but tonight something had shifted completely. Margaret was still wiping her eyes when she sat down in the kitchen. Samuel lit the fire. Abigail placed 3 plates on the table. No one said much. They didn't have to. Instead of a celebration, there was a simplicity. Warm bread rising in the oven, soup simmering on the stove, and the smell of cinnamon filling the air. Margaret reached across the table to help Abigail roll the dough. "Make sure it's tight," she said gently, "so the filling doesn't fall out." "Like this?" Abigail asked. "Exactly." Samuel leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, watching them. "Do you ever miss city life?" he asked suddenly. Margaret smiled, not once. There was laughter, soft and real. The fire cracked, and the silence that once haunted the house was now filled with life. After supper, they sat by the hearth, Samuel with a book in hand, Margaret mending a torn sleeve, Abigail curled in a blanket, half asleep. No rings, no wedding, but a family unmistakable. Later, when Abigail was tucked into bed and the house had gone quiet again, Margaret stepped outside onto the porch. The stars were out, shimmering like a spilled jar of sugar across the sky. Samuel joined her a few minutes later, mug of coffee in hand. They didn't speak at first. Then she said quietly, "You didn't have to do what you did today." "I did," he replied. "I should have done it sooner." Margaret turned to look at him, not asking for anything, not expecting anything. Samuel met her gaze. "There won't be a ring," he said honestly. "Not yet. Maybe never. I'm not asking for one." "I know," he paused. "But I want you here." Margaret nodded slowly. "I already am." They stood there in the night, side by side, nothing more needed. Because in that moment, Margaret knew she hadn't just been chosen by a little girl desperate for a mother. She'd been chosen by a man who had locked his heart for years, only to open it quietly, deliberately, and forever. Sometimes the truest vows are never spoken. Sometimes the loudest "I love you" is just a hand on your shoulder and a place set for you at the table. Margaret thought she was just hired to cook, but she became a mother, a partner, a home, not by chance but by choice. If this story stirred something in your heart, show it some love. Tap that hype button and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales where love rises from silence and families are built, one quiet act at a time. We'll see you on the next ride.